Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 17th of May, 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, delighted that we will have David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives with us. Skype communication is reasonable today. We may possibly have some slight delays, but we'll see. It's raining, so we better move on to Conservatives, I think. And David, you sent this one through to us, Conservative woman, Vive la Différence, and a lady called Laura Perrins is pointing a finger at May and saying really to other Conservatives, well, it's your fault, we've got what she's delivering. And the meat of this is of course that Theresa May is absolutely big state, big dictatorial state, and she's not interested in slightly more cosy social policies. Don't know whether you've got any thoughts.
It's interesting stuff, isn't it? Because really, Middle England and what was, I mean, there's been a lot of analogies about May to Thatcher, and frankly, it's not. There isn't. It's a nonsense. It's a completely different cabinet, a completely different mindset. And the thing that differentiates between May and Maggie, of course, was Maggie said no, 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 flatly to Jacques Delors when she was asked for military union at that stage in 1984. So Middle England loves Her Majesty's Armed Services, and Middle England loves the Queen. And under the current arrangements, I don't see any analogy here at all. I don't see any likeness in what's being done. So full stop on that one.
Okay, and interesting to see that the division's now starting inside the Conservative movement, the wider Conservative movement. We're going to be having a little look at a bit more of that later in the news. But Labour, Mike.
Yes, of course, Jeremy Corbyn released the Labour Party manifesto yesterday, if anybody's worried about that. The usual headlines in the mainstream media focusing on tax hikes for the top 5% of incomes, tax hikes for corporations is how they're selling it. And of course, The Sun, amongst others, saying, well, you know, it's back to the old, will the last person to leave Britain please turn off the lights type of rhetoric. Because, of course, if we have tax hikes of the top 5%, we're going to lose our best
people,
capabilities,
leaders,
apparently best leaders. Yes, that's right. So, you know, he has stuff about funding for schools. It includes funding for mental health for children in schools. I'm not sure if you've got any thoughts on that, but it sort of didn't leave me feeling terribly warm, because that's going to put the common purpose types on reheat, I think, as they try to gain some of these contracts. He is banning fracking, which they say would lock us into an energy infrastructure based on fossil fuels. They're promoting renewables, particularly tidal lagoons, and they're promoting nuclear. They're saying that the referendum result, they stand by that, but they're going to put the national interest first. It's not clear what that necessarily means. They're going to prioritise jobs and living standards, build a close new relationship with the European Union, protect workers' rights and environmental standards, provide certainty to EU nationals, and give a meaningful role to Parliament throughout the negotiations. So not really any different to what anybody else is saying, as far as I can see, at least not in any detail. Trade. Labour is committed to the international rules-based order. Brian, you'll be glad to know that. Extending democracy, so they're going to continue with the devolution agenda, with city-states and so on. Global Britain, they're even taking Theresa May's catchphrase of Global Britain. They intend to continue to spend 0.7% on international development, particularly on promoting civil society in other countries. So, of course, that's British soft power in these countries. They say that Labour believes Britain's foreign policy should be guided by values of peace, universal rights and international law. I think the Labour Party's got some pretty short memories if that's what they're saying at this point, but perhaps under Corbyn they're changing. They're going to reclaim, they say, Britain's leading role in tackling climate change. So that's interesting too. If you remember who Jeremy Corbyn's brother is. They commit to 2% on defence spending, so exactly the same as the Tories there. They're going to publish a defence industrial strategy white paper, including a national shipbuilding strategy, which is going to secure long-term future for defence industry workers. But what's a couple of interesting points. They're going to build this national infrastructure transformation fund, as they're calling it, a £250 billion fund for investment in infrastructure, transport, energy systems, communications, scientific research, housing for the 21st century. They're going to use that, of course, they're going to take in private money for that. They're not going to use national credit for it, although they are going to direct where this money is being spent. High-speed railways, HS2 to Scotland, Crossrail for the north of England, tying together the northern cities, as they say, a new Brighton main line. So some useful spending there if they can raise the money. Well, the other interesting thing I picked out of this was Glass-Steagall. Well, not quite. What they're saying is they're going to overhaul the regulation of the financial system, putting in place a firm ring fence between investment and retail banking that will protect consumers. I'm still highly skeptical about that if what they're talking about is a ring fence, Brian, and not full separation of the banks. Although what they do say is that they'll single out Royal Bank of Scotland and launch a consultation on breaking up that bank. So that would be a useful step, but not enough, I think.
Not enough, and no mention of the Bradbury, which of course Jeremy Corbyn signed the early day motion and then didn't want to go near it. So
absolutely, but David, although there are a few useful things in this manifesto, I think if you take it as a whole, we find that there's really nothing to separate Labour's position on many of these policy areas and the Tories.
Well, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, there isn't any difference, and this is the problem, is because the policies of one or the other party have pretty much merged. You know, I mean, we could argue that the new Conservatives have just adapted policies from New Labour. You know, this is sort of what Peter Hitchens is saying. You know, and yeah, it's just under the current status there of them just particular to defence. If they're saying they're going to stick to the 2%, you know, it doesn't alter anything. It doesn't change any of our master problems without redirecting, you know, and having a reset from a master perspective on defence and industry and complete withdrawal from EU military unification process, and then start talking about what we want to set as defence spending. So at the moment, what they're doing is actually saying, well, we'll subscribe to the direction from the EU of 2% and NATO. You know, NATO, EU, NATO, same thing now. It's basically, you know, it's basically the same problem. Without approaching it from that mindset, and this is where John Redwood, within the 1922 Backbench Committee, and as an ex-minister himself, and so on and so forth, has said that this needs to be reset. So it's not. There's no excuse here with the Tory party. They've got an advocate in there who's saying the right thing. We've got to start from a new perspective, come out of that EU arrangement, and then reset our defence spending. So obviously, all these old guard that are now saying we need to spend more. Well, we need to spend more, but it needs to be from a reset position. We've got to redirect policy, redirect everything away from the EU back into the UK. And until we do that, whether we spend 2% as it is or whatever, won't change anything.
Somebody in the chat box, Brian, saying, you know, Britain is a laughing stock. Without the United States, we don't have any influence in the world. I just want to say again, the Labour manifesto saying they will maintain the 0.7% funding for the Department for International Development and international soft power money. That's where Britain's influence in the world lies. And we'll be coming on to that in a few minutes when we talk about the BBC. But in the meantime, let's move across the Atlantic to Donald Trump. And perhaps this gives us a clue as to what a Britain under Jeremy Corbyn would be like, actually, because clearly the fractiousness and the infighting amongst the people around Donald Trump is just reaching fever pitch now. So they're now talking about impeachment, as we mentioned yesterday. Now we've got new reports claiming that Trump urged Comey to end the Michael Flynn investigation, and that's why Comey was sacked. They're just trying any tack that they can to continue with this hysterical media coverage over Trump. And here we've got Foreign Affairs magazine saying, tweeting out, these days it's not always clear where a foreign threat ends and a domestic threat begins. And they're highlighting an article that they've published, Intelligence in the Presidency, and the sort of teaser for that says the relationship between Trump and the intelligence community needs to be recalibrated. The president must understand that alternative facts have no place in the world of intelligence professionals. Well, that's absolutely true, but we don't have to go back too far to, if we just say the word yellow cake, to say that alternative facts have been a feature of the intelligence community for many years. And for Foreign Policy magazine to come off with this kind of stuff is hypocrisy beyond belief.
Desperation, Mike, and I think it's getting fascinating to see similarities between what's happening in the UK, what's happening in America. So we say, perhaps we could use Alex Thompson's term, the deeper state is clearly at work.
Absolutely. So then we come on to this. This is RT. The headline is NATO making up Russian threat to justify its own existence, and that's according to a former Intel chief. This is Yves Bonnet, the former head of French counterintelligence, speaking to Russia Today. He said that the Russians are no longer villains. The Soviet threat has vanished primarily because the USSR doesn't exist anymore. He said that the claims of aggressive behavior coming from the United States are exaggerated. And he said, I believe that NATO intentionally fuels the perception of Russia as a threat. Like any organization, the North Atlantic Alliance wants to continue existing, and the only reason for prolonging its existence is you, the Russians, he said. The international menace, the idea of that doesn't work anymore. I can assure you that the French people, fortunately, no longer believe it. I wonder, does anybody in Britain believe it anymore?
A few do, but we're working on that as hard as we can, I think. Well, on the subject of Russia, let's bring in this one, a Russia Today report, but they are reporting it, and it is important information. So it's saying that the Syrian army is rapidly advancing on a UK-US Special Forces base. A bit of the text is this, that the Syrian government forces accompanied by Iranian Hezbollah fighters are within 15 miles of a joint US-UK Special Forces base, sparking fears of a confrontation. And of course, they go on in this article to say that the British government simply won't comment on this because this involves the operation of special forces, and the government doesn't comment on the operation of special forces. So, Mike, you had a big fob off by Ministry of Defence when you asked questions about UK forces
operating on the Jordanian border, and so they have denied that categorically. This report, and if you look back over the UK Column News over the last 2 or 3 days, you'll find reports from other news outlets as well, which strongly suggest that Britain and the United States working along that border with the Free Syrian Army and other groups which might be described as terrorist groups. And
the risk of a confrontation with the Russians growing because, of course, we're now putting units closer and closer together. But all of this is done without a single word of discussion in the open in front of the British public. So what have we got operating? Theresa May, Michael Fallon's private army.
Well, it's interesting that Peter Ford, the ex-British ambassador to Syria that spoke to us on Inside Vox a couple of weeks ago, was saying to Alex Thompson this morning that, of course, if there was such a problem between Syria and Russia and the UK and the US, that has the potential absolutely to affect this general election.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Right, let's move on. Bit of an ad here for Media on Trial. This is being run by the Frome Stop War group. Patrick Henningsen, Vanessa Beeley, Professor Piers Robinson, Robert Stewart, Professor Tim Hayward speaking at that. That's on Sunday, the 11th of June, 7 p.m. In the Cheese and Grain in Frome. And do get along to that if you possibly can. Information on screen if you want to freeze the video later on, and also on Facebook. And now, of course, they're talking about the media and the veracity of the media and so on. We're going to show a little video clip here of BBC Media Action because going back to this point that was that was made in the chat box earlier about Britain's influence in the world. Just have a look at this short 2 or 3 minute video, and then we can discuss Britain's influence in the world.
At BBC Media Action, we know that media and communication are powerful tools for social and behavior change. In Bangladesh, Ethiopia, India and South Sudan, our health programs have reached an estimated 90 million people. But it's not just about reaching people. It's about what they do next. Human beings are complex, so it's not always as easy as listen, learn, act. Because of this complexity, each of our health projects is underpinned by a theory of change. In other words, how we expect media and communication to lead to change by influencing things like people's knowledge of the correct healthy behaviors, talking about health issues with family members or health workers, people's feelings of motivation and confidence about new practices, and people's perceptions of what others in the community think and do. Take antenatal care. To test if our theories of change were on the right track, we used structural equation modeling powered by data collected from large-scale surveys with thousands of people. This analysis uncovered the underlying pathways between our media programs and having a safe pregnancy and birth. As expected, the results revealed a complex web. In Bangladesh, it looks like this. To isolate the impact of our programs on each driver of behavior change, we used a technique called regression analysis. We found that women who watched our programs were significantly more likely to know that they need to attend antenatal checkups and be able to identify at least 3 benefits than those who did not. They were significantly more likely to think that it's normal for women to go to antenatal care in the first trimester of pregnancy. Their discussions with their husbands were more helpful and accurate. And, ultimately, they were more than twice as likely to have gone for antenatal care during their most recent pregnancy. We use statistics to test our theories about behavior change and to rule out other explanations such as income, education, and distance to a healthcare provider. And it's not just on pregnancy checkups in Bangladesh where we see great results. We have found that audiences exposed to our programs in Bangladesh and Ethiopia know more, discuss more, and are more supportive towards a range of maternal and child health behaviors. All of this research, in addition to qualitative methods we employ, adds to the growing evidence base showing how mass media can help change behavior and improve health outcomes across large, diverse populations.
So Brian, it's hard to know where to start with this. What we have here is the BBC, funded by the taxpayer, pushing out programming into countries in order to affect people's behaviour. They're then using insights to discover what the effect of that behaviour was. They're using these people, they're sending in what seems like a good, a positive thing, which is antenatal health care, as this example was making the point, and using that as the cover for using thousands of millions of people as lab rats in behavioural change. And of course, if they can change the people's behaviour in one area of their lives, they're using those tools then to change people's behaviours in other areas of their lives. This is so unbelievably dangerous. I don't even know where to begin.
Well, I think we'll have to do a dedicated segment on it. But you're absolutely right. And of course, we can say first of all that note that they go in on soft policy, but women are targeted. Now, people may be saying yes, but they're only looking after the health of the ladies. I say they're not. They're going for a soft target because that will enable them to get in amongst family level, get between men and women. This is the start of the breakdown of the target society. And this is the same BBC charity, of course, that has still boasts on its own website, that its people were on the ground in Syria helping to drive regime change by working with the disaffected people inside Syria.
In the early, in sort of 2009, 2010 time, this is before the stuff started, which caused the so-called war in the first place.
The violence kicked off. They were under the surface working to get rid of Assad, and this was being done through the BBC's political charity. And you notice they're talking about correct policies. This is correct according to the BBC. And they're also saying, well, our theories are. So theories are being unleashed on target populations. Just unbelievably dangerous. We will do more on this, but David, just a quick comment. It's becoming ever more clear, of course, the British foreign policy is just not being run through Westminster. It's being run through the civil service, the Foreign Office, the Department for International Development, with the support of Common Purpose, and of course this vast propaganda machine, the BBC.
Yeah, it's in effect a shadow government, and those people who sit in Parliament as members who may be thinking that they're part of the government and the system need to have a good look at what's actually behind all this, because they need to start doing their jobs. Otherwise, they're just, as one or two members have said, just puppets. Yeah, puppet Parliament.
Just puppet. Well, bearing in mind what the BBC is doing there, I'm going to say that I think many of our senior military officers, retired officers, have absolutely no idea this sort of policy is going on. And they've certainly got no idea that Common Purpose, another political charity, has been buried inside the civil service and the Cabinet Office directing policy. So let's look at this letter, which you've identified, which has just come forward. I'm sorry the text is a bit small on it, but it's to Theresa May. It's come from a group of very senior retired military officers. It says the nation hopes that June's election will produce a government strong enough to conduct the tough Brexit negotiations, promote wider trading partnerships and maintain our security. But then really what it's going on to say is that there isn't enough money and there's big problems in the military. I picked up on this particular quote, but while the policy remains in place, that's the existing defence policy, events have shown that the necessary funding is simply not there to give it substance. Responses by the MOD to questions about the adequacy of the defence budget raised by respected and informed commentators have been disingenuous, evading the issue by the relentless quoting of irrelevant financial statistics. I think what they're saying in very nice senior office language is the Ministry of Defence has been lying. Let's bring in the second part of that letter. You can see big block of signatures at the bottom of the page there. But again, I pulled out this quote. The armed services are having to seek further very damaging savings in manpower, support and training at a time when the likelihood of combat operations is increasing. The realities of the security situation must be faced. They have been largely kept from public debate, despite the efforts of the media and the valedictory messages of recently serving senior officers, etc. So in this letter, David, we've effectively got a group of senior retired people talking about the disastrous state of the armed forces at the moment, and the fact that when they and others start to ask questions about this, the MOD simply lies to them. This is a pretty dangerous position.
It's extremely dangerous. And what we're seeing is a repeat of attempts by senior officers to speak out on this issue, which has come round quite frequently. This is not the first time. This is a repeat pattern. And what's happening is that those guys are starting to wake up. This is effectively the David Richards group, and they are effectively doing this under their own merit and their own rank, and doing the right thing, which is speaking up and challenging the government on this position. They're quite correct. This has been kept from the general public, and that is a deliberate attempt, because if the general public knew full well what was going on with the key issue of our military being unified into the EU, which is currently the master policy position, which dictates the money, right? So these guys are arguing about there's a lack of money. No, the policy first directs the direction and the course, and the money then comes along subsequent. So they're quite right, and it's been kept from the public because the British people would not, under any circumstances, en masse, regardless of party, support Her Majesty's Armed Services going into EU military union. So what we've got to look at here is the master reset has to take place. So the Brexit has to mean Brexit, and it has to mean Brexit for the military. So, I mean, these guys are effectively the non-veterans for Britain group of officers. And I mean, they're calling the MOD out, which is right, but this is no different to what Julian Thompson and Sandy Woodward did in 2010. So we haven't had the change. The change has to come when we use the correct terms of reference. So we must use the reference on basically that this is the key thing. We're not talking about an EU army, all right? What we're talking about is our army being unified into the EU. And that is a very different concept. It's easy for everyone at the ballot box to assimilate just exactly what that means. So the current settings are lock, stock, and all of Her Majesty's barrels will be left in the EU as it stands, and they will dictate spending. There will be no change. They can call the spending out as much as they want, and that's right. That is part of the problem, because going over to your mindset on this, Brian, defence cuts, UK defence cuts, very bad thing. You know, lots of officers have spoken out. It's a bad thing. You know, shouldn't be doing this. It's a bad thing. Well, what about if it's a good thing? What about if it's a good thing for the EU to unify? We're going through a unification process into a single point controlled military, and I'm putting it out there. I'm submitting it to the general public. What about if this is a good job? UK defence cuts are a good job for the EU. So that's the perspective we need to be approaching this from.
Right. Thank you for that. Let's just bring in Veterans for Britain. Now, you've been having a dialogue with Veterans for Britain, albeit that it seems to have been a bit slow in the early days, but this is just a screenshot of the Veterans for Britain page. What we're interested in today is some tweets that have come out from Veterans for Britain. And what they're saying here is that basically there's movement now towards these European HQs, military HQs. In fact, you and the UK column have been warning for months and months that the HQs are not coming. They're already in existence and operational. But down here in this particular tweet, it refers to the creation of an EU HQ. Interestingly, at the top of the tweet, it's also, for the first time we've seen from Veterans for Britain, talking about EU military unification. So something seems to be on the move there. But they've also pushed out this, which is talking about coordinated annual review on defence. And the moment I saw this, I thought of your warnings about the fact that the aim is for the EU to have a fully integrated military procurement system and the financial backing of a treasury to run this. So here's Veterans for Britain just starting to warn about this. And then here's a bit more on this HQ. And they say this time the military-focused unelected bureaucrats are right. UK should have objected to operational HQ back in February. Well, this is a bit of a disingenuous comment because, of course, Veterans for Britain is fully aware that the HQs only arrived because Britain had already fully committed to full EU military unification.
And of course, we got the evidence for that in the last couple of days when Michael Fallon and Boris Johnson's only complaint about this new EU HQ was its name. David?
That's completely correct. I met with David Banks, the founder of Veterans for Britain, right at the start of the beginning of the Brexit campaign. So the majority of those officers, I think we've had probably dialogue with on one level or another, and Mr. Banks as well, on the subject of these EU C3s, the existing EU C3s that were built by the Royal Navy quite some time ago. They're built to NATO spec, and there's one, a large one at Northwood, our own RN nuclear HQ with 100 EU staff in it, which I've had confirmed from an admiral, and it's apparently across the corridor from our own nuclear HQ. So there's not really a great deal of separation there between the two forces and the two agendas, and I don't understand how you would, from my own point of view, keep nuclear secret with that many people around from another state, effectively. So I just frankly don't accept that this is anything. Fallon isn't vetoing anything. He's not vetoing anything because they already exist. There's one in Paris, there's one in Potsdam, and there's one in Greece, and they're quite capable of conducting full EU military matters on a pan-European scale within 24 hours, if so activated in a situation built to NATO spec.
And David,
So, I mean, Fallon is vetoing nothing. These things already exist. The only thing they're arguing about here is the game's up. Yep. The game's up. They've been busted. There's a crisis level within the Tory party, and they don't know what to do with it.
Right, the game's up. They're under huge pressure because they know the truth is coming out. But let's just come back to Veterans for Britain. You identified this election advice which has been pushed out. Let's just expand that a bit so we can see it. They're saying that we need to tackle people during the run-up to the election, and then they've given you some summary key points here. Most of this, as you say, is about funding, that we need to have this 2% target met in order to get the right equipment. But there's absolutely no reference to the fact that both the Conservatives and, of course, Liberal, Lib Dems, Labour MPs have been working behind the scenes to lock the British military into the EU. So I'm going to say, do you think this is just naive of Veterans Britain? Do they still not understand the picture? Or is there something else going on here that they simply won't push this EU unification in front of the public and specifically in front of military veterans?
It's a splendid question. From my own point of reference, which, I mean, I've been doing this a lot longer than challenging this issue for a lot longer than Veterans for Britain has been about. So from my own point of view, when we went into Vote Leave, and they were first given the designation, they refused. So this is the Vote Leave management and directors. There's a few political figures in there. A lot of those we've met and had dialogue with as well. But across that spectrum between the managers there, the special project managers, the directors, and the politicians, there was an absolute refusal to debate or engage or accept that EU military unification or EU military union was an issue or was anything to do with the Brexit campaign, was anything to do with getting our sovereignty back. There was an absolute refusal to engage on it, which is entirely linear with the Conservative Party. From my interaction with ministers, backbenchers, and so on and so forth, an utter refusal to debate this issue. So those two things, as far as I'm concerned, are quite linear with Vote Leave and the Tory party. So my questions here really are as to the effectiveness and how constructive, campaigning groups are going to be. So I would like to see a little bit more, I'd like to see a lot more actually forward campaigning on this, rather than effectively what we're seeing is posthumous announcements. We're seeing announcements of what the EU has done, and it's already too late. The horse is already out the traps. So that's not really any good. And it's not as if I haven't had considerable dialogue with Mr. Banks on this subject.
Yeah. Well, let's bring in Mr. Banks, as it were, at this stage. And this was just fascinating. This was moving around on Twitter a few weeks ago, but it said that David Banks joined the EU movement ahead of the referendum date. This is back in 2016, I think, this particular report. It's quite a detailed article. People might like to go and read it. And here's the gentleman concerned. And he was working, amongst others, with Will Shaw. So I'm a bit puzzled here that we've got a man who on one hand is part of the European movement, he's pro-EU, and then he switches across and he's suddenly part of Vote Leave. But if I can just run through a couple of other things, and then perhaps we can have a little bit of a discussion on it. This, obviously, Veterans for Britain, we got another tweet here where they're actually showing support for Change Britain. And I found this quite an interesting trail, because who are these people? You're following more and more sites on the web. Who has created these sites? What are the real agenda? You don't quite know. What does Change Britain look like? Well, it looks like this. And it says that it's there in order to help achieve a sort of clean Brexit so that everybody knows what's happening. But as I delve into it, I find myself getting more confused as to who is who and what the real objective is. One thing we can see for sure, Mike, is that we are seeing a great input in social media. Clearly, the intent is to capture people's minds and views via social media. But if we pop back from Change Britain to Veterans for Britain. We've got this gentleman who's key, Lee Rotherham. He's interesting man. He says that he's a veteran Eurosceptic, historian, author, think tank sensei, if I've pronounced that correctly, an Afghan DJ. I'm really not sure what that means. And he's an engagingly nerdy person, according to The Guardian. So this man's one of the powerhouses behind Veterans for Britain. I say, who is he exactly? This is interesting down here because he refers to the Red Cell. But this was part of a tweet he'd pushed out where he's forwarding on something to do with artificial intelligence. So I thought of you, Mike, when I saw this. And somebody's saying it's pretty difficult for artificial intelligence to tell the difference between a chihuahua or a muffin. And on one hand, you can say, well, this is interesting and slightly humorous. On the other hand, it gives you an insight into Lee Rotherham's mind. And I wonder what he's up to, particularly as he calls his other outfit a Red Cell. And when you go to have a look at that, you're directed to CIA information where the intelligence community was setting up specialist cells, in this case, to challenge US military security after 9/11. So it's very weird stuff. As always, go and have a look at this yourself, but this is what I found when I went looking for a Red Cell. But here's Lee Rotherham, who's deeply embedded in Veterans for Britain, running his own Red Cell. And if we're going to have a look at the patrons, he's got an interesting mix of political heavyweights. David, I was fascinated by this. I just dropped this over the top. Who is Lee Rotherham and what is his real agenda? Are you able to help us with this at all? Because I'm by no means clear.
Yeah, Lee's executive director there at Veterans for Britain. So you've got David Banks as PR press, a direct press interface. So the only interaction you can have off Veterans for Britain website, other than giving an email over, is interaction with David. So he conducts all the press and all the interface, as I understand it, with MPs and so on and so forth, and whatever they're doing in terms of campaigning. I've been to one of their campaign events in Portsmouth where Roger Lane Knott was absolutely outstanding, as was Julian Thompson. I wasn't very impressed at all with Julian Brazier because he didn't talk about EU military union at all. And I wasn't impressed with Penny Mordaunt because she didn't talk about EU military union at all, which is our principal issue. So where Lee Rotherham is concerned, so he's executive director over there. He's producing their papers. So there's this paper that's just came out about the 2% spending, which, frankly, it just doesn't really tackle our principal problem. And he co-authored the previous paper on the Nouvelle critique of a vague sort of EU defence union, which obviously, we need to be talking about EU military union and unification and what's actually happening, frame the target. So as I understand it, Lee is a parliamentary researcher in the office of John Hayes, Right Honourable John Hayes, Minister. And he's a approved parliamentary candidate, as I understand, and he's gone through parliamentary boarding in order to do that. So we've got somebody that's across the corridor from Steve Baker, some of the other people that we met right from the outset, and is hard at work there in Parliament as a parliamentary researcher. So I would like to see from Mr. Rotherham some hard-hitting stuff. And frankly, Brian, help me out here. Well, are you seeing it? Because we're not.
Well, what I get an impression of is a lot of people who are specialists in social media getting alongside the military. Now, whether the agenda is really to help those military people put out the warnings to what's going on, or perhaps the real agenda is to tie the military people down so that the warnings don't go out. Let's come in on a different gentleman. This is a guy called Darren Grimes. And fascinating. Vote Leave gave this, as described in the Independent Fashion Student, a mere £625,000 days before the EU referendum. So we have an unknown named young man getting vast amounts of money. There's Darren. We've also brought in another man there, Matthew Elliott. Let's just follow through on Darren Grimes. Here he is. And what's his expertise? Well, he's a social media guru. This is a man you bring in because he's trained to control the growth and development of digital campaigns. Now, what would be happening if it was the government that was actually starting to control public opinion on its policies by controlling social media? That'd be pretty interesting. Be pretty interesting as to where £625,000 came from. So we'll add a couple of pieces and then come back over to you. Bring in another one of these social websites, Brexit Central. And this has got a picture of Matthew Elliott on it. And it says 17 million people voted for the UK to leave the European Union. Brexit Central is here to provide an online home for all wanting to follow the twists and turns of our departure from the EU. So they're not speeding the departure up, as you've just said. Excuse me, David. They are sitting and commentating on things. They've happened, it's happened, we're going to talk about it a bit, and then we're going to carry on as if nothing's happened. So I put a bit of this together in a UK column wiring diagram, as it's known. I've brought in another gentleman, Jonathan Isaby. Now, he started off as the co-editor of Conservative Home, so we can be assured he's pretty friendly to the Tory party. He moves across to the Taxpayers Alliance. Many people have thought that has been a sort of movement of publicly aware people, but it appears that it's now got some sort of political control to it. And then he disappears across as editor to Brexit Central. So that's an interesting movement. We can bring in Matthew Elliott. Here he is. He was very big on Vote Leave, but he was also working in Business Britain, which was part of the Vote Leave camp, along with some of those other organisations I've shown. And he is also involved with Brexit Central. So we better then bring in young Darren Grimes, the man of 625,000, because he's deputy editor with Brexit Central. And then what we can see is communication between Mr. Banks of Veterans for Britain through Change Britain, and that is showing links through to this Brexit Central. So it seems to me that what we're looking at is a very comprehensive and well-developed Tory social media machine to control the way people see Brexit and maybe to slow down any adverse reactions to Theresa May's Brexit policy.
Yeah, quite. I mean, what you've got here is very, very clever, within the mechanics of what's going on here with Cambridge Analytica. Carol Cadwalladr at The Guardian has sort of looked into data harvesting, data acquisition. Once you've got an email, you can triangulate across anybody's social media, any of their digital outputs, and then within, as I understand it, within 6 moves, an accurate psychological profile of someone. And these real-time files exist for people that have got stuff out there on the internet. And within something like 30 moves on any digital footprint or digital trail that you'll leave on the internet, they will have a deadly accurate profile of you, and you could be drilled into and targeted for advertising or responses of any sort. So what we're effectively looking at here is a very sophisticated machine. And let's go back to what we know. Matthew Elliott and the directors at Vote Leave refused, with an admiral that I was working with, not in the Veterans for Britain group and not in the David Richards group, refused to debate this issue. So, but one thing is certain here. We know for a fact that EU military union is a vital and key component to the EU. Vital. It's as vital as the currency. The two go hand in glove. So it is an issue, and our military is an issue thereby, and our veterans are an issue, and our electorate are an issue. So, all those things are factual. So that's an absolute. And one thing we do know is, of course, is the politicians don't want to talk about it. So what have we got going on here? We just got some analysis taking place of what the veterans do when they are exposed to certain things. How do they react? Are we just watching are the digital ripples in the internet being analysed by this big data company to see what they would do or not do in order that you could tune a campaign. So that begs the question, who is controlling it and who has the prime perspective on that information? So that's deeply worrying, because what it's looking like here is that the top brass at CCHQ are seeing that.
Yep.
Because we've got people like John Hayes, who's a minister. He's a minister of the government, although he's not apparent in this network. You know, this guy shares an office. Yeah, I'm sorry. You know, you would be talking about this stuff. You know, one of the guys wants to be an MP. You know.
So we've got a massive machinery which links straight back to the Tory party. It shows itself to the public as if it is supporting the grassroots view of the 17 million people who say we want out of the EU and we want to come out totally. And what it's doing is monitoring what's happening and then presumably skewing that opinion.
Isn't that exactly what BBC Media Action is doing in other countries? We're having exactly the same operation played upon us. It's not the BBC doing it in this case, it's a whole operation around Tory central office.
Indeed. David, we'll just give you a short reply on that. We've just got a couple of other items to finish and the clock is moving.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is very straightforward. We've got the betrayal of our country in front of us, because they're not talking about what's going to happen to Her Majesty's Armed Services, our military, that regardless of whether you're a Middle England Tory, Labour, Liberal or UKIP or whatever, would not support this. We've got the betrayal of our veterans, a key thing that's happening. We've got them being pursued by the government and being put into court for doing their job, whether that be in Northern Ireland or Iraq or Afghanistan. So what we have got here, guys, is Veterans Gate. That's what this is.
Yeah. Right, David, we've just scratched the surface. We will devote more time to this. It's extremely interesting. We'll see if we can help clarify the picture as to what's actually going on. But thank you for your analysis. Now, a few days to go before Ian Crane's AV8. If you haven't got tickets, there are still day tickets available, which you can get through the website here. So you can freeze that on screen, have a look.
Quick reminder that, of course, UK Column will not be producing a news on Friday this week or Monday next as a result of us attending that conference. So just quickly, let's get on to this. The Sun today, failed by the system, how the Rochdale grooming gang victims are let down by the authorities that were meant to keep them safe. From the council chief executive to social workers, incompetent leaders betrayed the teenage victims of brutal sex trafficking gangs. And of course, this article here, the theme is that this was incompetence, it was people being let down and so on. They say vulnerable girls who were left to be preyed on by a sickening gang of sex offenders were let down by so many. Teenage victims of Rochdale's whose stories are told in the new BBC series Three Girls were failed by their police force, their community and their social workers, and so it goes on. Then this morning, possibly linked to this, Simon Danchuk, ex-MP, tweeted out, "Piece I wrote 3 years ago on the rise of unsackable and unaccountable public sector managers and child protection failings." And he links to this Telegraph article that he wrote in 2014. Rotherham is not an isolated incident. And again, here he falls for the same thing. He says, despite talking about the reality that existed a few minutes' drive from their offices, there was no awareness of what life was like for these kids, no connection, no empathy. The head of Rochdale Safeguarding Children's Board told me they needed to take, quote, a deeper dive into the theory to understand the problem. The director of Children's Services implied to me that young girls who were being raped were making lifestyle choices. She later admitted to an incredulous Home Affairs Select Committee that she'd never met any of the victims. And so it's all about incompetence again. And I just wanted to make the point that unless people can get to grips with the common purpose effect, they cannot understand where what is being described as incompetence is coming from, because, Brian, it's not incompetence.
Absolutely not incompetence. at all. It's being driven, it's an agenda, and we're getting very close to seeing that agenda. And I'm going to say really appalling information coming in about the abuse of refugee children in Britain's sanctuary city, Sheffield. And quite clearly, refugee, immigrant children are being targeted. When members of the community attempt to protect those children, it is the social services themselves that are leaking names back into the community, which has resulted in beatings and rapes, or indeed raids by the police. So something very, very nasty happening. And of course, we have been continually warning that you see a change in empathy of people wherever the political charity common purpose is involved. We'll end on I'll say a quasi-happy note. We've just put John Wedger's face up. We've been saying how this policeman who's brave enough to stand up and be counted as a Met police officer warning about the cover-up of child abuse in London has had no support from any of the people shown on screen. What's actually happened to him is his pay has now been stopped by the Metropolitan Police. And we'd like to draw you to this website, fundingmorality.com/Wedger. And this is a statement put out by Wilfred Wong, who we've interviewed on the UK column before. Wilfred is trying to assist John Wedger because he's now being put under immense financial pressure. He could lose his home as a result of the stopping of his pay by the Met Police. This is malicious. This is bullying, harassment by the Met Police. Wilfred is saying, if you believe in what this man is trying to do, please support him through this particular funding site. And I will add to that we've had some money sent to us here at the UK column. And one of those letters said, we're sending John Wedger money as a thank you for doing his job, which I think really says it all. But I would just add, we would much prefer that you send donations through to that site. I will make it more visible in future news programmes. But if the public wants to do something about this massive establishment cover-up of the abuse of children, we need to support brave whistleblowers like John Wedger and, of course, Melanie Shaw and others. That's it. David, thank you for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Right.